Okay, so this is actually my first video. Those of you who follow me on Facebook know that I usually respond to politics and religion and things like that, and I do so in a really, kind of long-winded way because I have a lot to say about it. Actually, on this specific issue, I have so much to say that I couldn't get it into a Facebook post that anybody would read without giving me carpal tunnel syndrome and hurting your eyes. So I'm going to sum it up here in this video. So, from the accounts that I've read and seen, what appeared to have happened was a group uh, of Nazis, white supremacists, from the alt-right, which is basically like the Antifa terrorist group, domestic terrorist group, I would call them, but for the right. Unsavory people, bad people, got together to protest the taking down of a Lee memorial. General Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Confederacy during the Civil War. So the monument had been taken down, and as a response that had been in the works for some time by this alt-right white supremacist group, they wanted to get together and protest it. So at first it was going to be anyone who was against the taking down of the statue to show up and protest. But what ended up happening was it kind of morphed into this strictly Nazi type gathering. And so they had gotten all the correct permits and things to peacefully assemble. And sort of at the last minute, those permits were pulled. And so you have a group of people that feel that they were wronged and that their freedom of speech was taken away. And they're already upset at the taking down of the memorial. And so apparently they decided to go ahead and go through with the protest. Well, it led to bloodshed after the Antifa, which, as I said before, is the same as the alt-right, but on the left, and vocal members of the Black Lives Matter group showed up to counter-protest. Now, if you've been following what Antifa has been doing and the alt-right has been doing, both of these groups seem to bring violence with them wherever they go, and neither of them necessarily represent the left or the right. They're kind of the extreme groups on both ends. But due to the way that this thing was carried out, it seemed almost engineered to lead to bloodshed.
And in this group, you had this guy, this moron, James Alex Fields, who I guess had his emotions running high at the start of the day, and apparently he's always at a 10, no matter what's going on. But anyway, he shows up, he gets upset, he feels like he's not being heard the way he wants to be heard, and so he jumps into his sports car and mows down some innocent victims like a complete jerk.
In the group of counter-protesters was this woman, Heather Heyer, a lawyer who showed up to these things quite often to protest, or to counter-protest in this case, what she perceived to be flagrant abuses of freedom of speech, hate speech, as she called it, and other people call it, which was exemplified by the Nazis. So as she's basically crossing the street or blocking the road, that much isn't too clear at the moment. This James Alex Fields got in his car and ran people over, killing her, and there were 3 fatalities at this gathering altogether. So that is kind of the setting for what happened, as far as what I've read so far. There are a few things that kind of struck me as odd and kind of bothered me about this whole thing. It seemed to me like it was almost engineered to create bloodshed. You had permits granted and then taken away from the original protesting group. You had a counter-protesting group show up that was allowed to march, and you had police that were curiously absent.
So before I move on to my take on this issue, I just want to say in the strongest possible terms that my heart is with the victims. A couple of cops died while surveying the scene in a helicopter, apparently. But, she was there, carrying on her right to free speech and doing what she thought was the right thing, and it ultimately led to her death. So I just wanted to say that.
And as far as the man, the guy that got in his car and ran people over because he doesn't know how to handle things like an adult, I mean, all you can say for people like that is that they are pieces of shit, and that's what this guy is. I don't know anybody in my personal life, anybody on the conservative side that would support or condone what this guy did. In my eyes, he's the same as any Islamic terrorist who gets in their car and crashes into innocent people. He's a punk. Obviously, what these white supremacists were there to say is not popular. Most people don't condone what they say. They're there to talk about how white people are supreme, and apparently a lot of these guys look to General Lee as this white representation of, the last time where white people had a chance to take over the world and be the leading race in the United States of America. And that obviously isn't a message that most people agree with. I know I certainly don't, but I do think that his speech, which some say should be outlawed because they classify it as hate speech, a purely subjective kind of thing. I think hate speech is unpopular speech, and I think unpopular speech is the type of speech that needs to be protected. Popular speech doesn't need protection.
In the marketplace of ideas, you have popular ones and unpopular ones. You have popular speech and unpopular speech. Now, the white supremacists were there in Virginia that day to spread unpopular speech. Some may call it hate speech, but it's still freedom of speech, and they had the right to be there. Now, what you can't do is defeat fascists with fascism, and that's what Antifa and Black Lives Matter resorted to. They stood on this battlefield with fascists and behaved in a fascist manner themselves. You can't do that. There's something I've heard said that you don't have to show up to every fight you're invited to. And these Nazis, these white supremacists had scheduled this a long time ago. They were going to be there. Everybody knew they were going to show up and say some incendiary things. And Black Lives Matter and Antifa did not have to show up there. It was a recipe for disaster. But because we know that these idiots on both sides are going to show up and do this, the police had to be there as a buffer between the two groups to honor freedom of speech. With regard to my feeling that this seems almost engineered, like it was a recipe for disaster that, people knew was going to happen and let happen. You had the organizing group, the original group. They got the permits, then those permits were canceled at the last minute. They went through with it, and then an opposing group showed up to counter-protest. Police were not there to act as an appropriate buffer between the two. And for whatever reasons those things happened, they could have been prevented. We know this is how people react whenever freedom of speech is taken to extremes. Anyway, that's how I feel about, I think it could have been prevented. I think there's a lot of people that share the blame in this, the alt-right and the alt-left, and the city officials that didn't put police in the right place, or the police that chose to not act as an appropriate buffer for whatever reason. But at the end of the day, the person solely responsible for the violence was James Alex Fields. And he used his car to kill people, and he will answer for that, and it's his fault.
All right, that much said, let me get back to what started this whole thing, which was the memorial to General Robert E. Lee. If you're familiar with history, you understand that Robert E. Lee was not pro-slavery. In fact, he was Abraham Lincoln's first choice to lead the Union Army. He turned that down because he didn't want to fight against his home state. And so he ended up leading the Confederacy during the Civil War.
Regardless of whether you think Lee is a hero or a bad person because he chose to lead the Confederacy during the Civil War, he, by all accounts, and judging strictly by the context of his time period, was a decent human being. And, whether you want to fault him for what he chose to do, we have memorials to this guy for a good reason. He was an extraordinary man in an extraordinary time.
I think we're at a troublesome time with race relations and political tensions in this country. I think that there are a lot of people in the media that are purposely trying to distort certain things in order to make Donald Trump and all conservatives look bad, especially with this thing where it seems like they want to paint with a broad brush and assign every conservative, sort of the culpability to what this one guy did on an extreme fringe group.
And I, for one, don't think that conservatives are responsible for what Fields ended up doing. I don't think Trump is responsible for what Fields ended up doing. And if you are going to suggest that Trump is responsible, then by extension, you have to apply that to Barack Obama as well. Is Barack Obama responsible for the 5 dead cops and 9 injuries, from the black activists that shot officers in an ambush during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement? I don't think that anyone on the left would allow that Barack Obama is somehow to blame for what Micah Johnson did whenever he ambushed and killed 5 officers in Dallas last year. Just like I don't think anyone on the right would necessarily allow that Trump is somehow responsible for what James Alex Fields did in mowing down those counter-protestors with his muscle car in Charlottesville, Virginia. They were extremists and they acted extremely. That's it.
We seem to be at a point where we as a society have become a self-fulfilling prophecy of our own worst nightmare. We see things constantly in the news about this group or that group getting violent, this group or that group degrading another group. Basically, the perennial stories of mankind being mean to other humans for whatever reasons they think justify it. And while most violence is inexplicable and easily attributed to one person, with the context contributing little to the situation in terms of whether or not the crime had a sensible motivation, this story is a lot more complex than that. I'm not saying that this person was justified in what he did. I condemn what he did in the strongest possible terms, and I'm not interested, nor do I believe in, defending the violence of a white supremacist or a white supremacy group. I hate white supremacists and I hate what they stand for. But I do believe that people who want to modify our definition of free speech as something that excludes hate speech, whatever that means, they wanted for something like this to happen. Or they expected it to happen and let it happen anyway. This horrible event advances the narrative that certain unpopular speech, as defined by certain people, is worthy of being excluded from the rights our founding fathers laid out for us. There's a slow and steady progression by many to unchain us from the freedoms we were granted in the Constitution of the United States of America. I believe that their end game is to turn us into a fascist type of country. Paradoxically, both sides of the debate call the other fascist, and so we've been left in a confusing cloud of uncertainty with regard to who is on the right side of history and who is on the wrong side of it. Hence, you have what happened at this event. But again, I'm not blaming the victims. I feel sorry for them and their mourning families. However, I do believe that there are people who allow things like this to happen or want them to happen because it advances their political narrative. In a sense, I'm saying that this white supremacist was motivated to do what he did based on false pretenses that were not dissuaded by reality or the media, because so many people were supporting ideas that this person, however vile he was, didn't have the right to freedom of speech. His group didn't have the right to freedom of speech because they were vile, which thereby reinforced this guy's negative opinion of all those opposed to him. You know, he thought of them as people who would gladly trample on his rights if he let them. And that's sad. You know, this was allowed to really sink in as true, probably in his mind when he showed up to use his freedom of speech to support keeping this statue in the public sphere, only to have urine and blood thrown at him and his kind instead of being met with equally powerful freedom of speech by the counter-protestors. Instead of those offended by this man's speech simply engaging in a war of words, instead of people, exposing this man's vile speech and this group's vile speech by, showcasing what being a real adult, a real intellectual adult is all about, they engaged on their level. And, it was kind of, the stage was set for violence, and this man's already inflamed psyche being incensed by what was happening with the counter-protesters, things were just allowed to boil over, especially when the police weren't acting as a buffer between the two hot-headed groups. So, yes, the counter-protesters contributed to what happened. Most definitely they did.